In the harsh winter of 1875, somewhere along the desolate frontier between civilization and wilderness, there stood a small log cabin that had weathered more storms than its sole inhabitant cared to remember. The man who lived there had long forgotten what it felt like to hear another human voice that wasn't his own echo bouncing off the wooden walls. His name was Thomas Webb, though it had been so long since anyone had spoken it aloud that sometimes he wondered if he had imagined his own identity. Thomas had come west 7 years ago with dreams that now seemed as distant as the stars. He had planned to build a ranch, find a wife, raise children who would inherit the land he would cultivate with his own hands. But the frontier had other plans. A harsh winter took his cattle in the first year. A summer drought destroyed his crops in the second. By the third year, he had given up on prosperity and settled for survival. The nearest town was a 3-day ride, and he made the journey only twice a year for supplies. The rest of the time, he existed in a solitude so complete that sometimes he spoke to the wind just to remember how words felt in his mouth. His days followed a pattern as predictable as the sunrise. Wake before dawn, tend to the small vegetable garden that somehow survived despite his best efforts to neglect it, chop wood, repair whatever part of the cabin had decided to surrender to age overnight, and as darkness fell, sit by the fire with a book he had read so many times he could recite entire passages from memory. The loneliness wasn't sharp anymore. It had dulled into a constant ache, like an old wound that never quite healed but became familiar enough to ignore. On a February evening when the snow fell so thick that Thomas could barely see 3 feet beyond his window, he heard something that made him question his sanity. Voices. Not his own, not the wind playing tricks, but actual human voices speaking in a language he didn't understand. He grabbed his rifle more out of habit than fear and opened the door to find 2 figures hunched against the storm, their forms barely visible through the swirling white chaos. They were women, he realized with a start. 2 Chinese women dressed in long flowing robes that seemed entirely inadequate for the brutal cold. One wore deep burgundy, the other bright red, and both were covered in snow as if they had been walking for hours. The woman in burgundy had a cut on her cheek, dried blood mixed with snowflakes creating a stark pattern against her pale skin. They looked at him with expressions that mixed desperation with dignity, their dark eyes pleading in a way that transcended language. Thomas didn't think. He simply stepped aside and gestured them in, the basic human instinct to help overriding years of practiced isolation. They stumbled inside, bringing with them a gust of freezing air and snow that immediately began melting on his wooden floor. He quickly shut the door and turned to face them, suddenly aware that he had no idea what to do next. The woman in red spoke first, her voice melodic despite the obvious exhaustion. She said something in what he assumed was Chinese, gesturing to herself and then to her companion, then to the storm outside. Thomas shook his head helplessly and pointed to himself. "Thomas," he said slowly. "My name is Thomas." The woman in burgundy, the one with a cut on her face, repeated carefully, "Thomas." Her pronunciation was soft, turning the harsh consonants into something almost musical. She then pointed to herself and said, "Mei Lin." Then to her companion, "Suyin." Over the next hour, through gestures and broken attempts at communication, Thomas pieced together fragments of their story. They had been traveling with a group, heading to California where Suyin's brother had established a business. There had been an attack, bandits or outlaws. Thomas couldn't quite understand which. The 2 women had managed to escape during the chaos, running blindly into the storm. They had been walking for what seemed like days, surviving on nothing but determination and luck, until they saw the light from Thomas's cabin window. He gave them blankets, heated water for tea, and prepared a simple stew from the vegetables and dried meat he had stored. As they ate, he studied them with a curiosity that felt almost painful after so many years of seeing only his own reflection. Mei Lin, the one in burgundy, was the older of the 2, though he guessed she couldn't be more than 30. She had a quiet strength about her, the way she tended to Suyin's minor injuries with efficient, practiced movements. Suyin was younger, perhaps in her early 20s, and despite the ordeal they had endured, there was something light in her spirit that occasionally broke through the exhaustion. That first night, Thomas gave them his bed and made himself a place by the fire. He lay awake for hours, listening to their soft breathing, the unfamiliar sound of other people in his space. It felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. He had grown so accustomed to silence that even their presence felt like a storm inside his chest.
The blizzard lasted 3 days.
3 days during which Thomas found himself learning a new language without words. Mei Lin would point to objects, say their name in Chinese, and he would respond with English. Suyin turned it into a game, laughing when Thomas's pronunciation of Chinese words came out mangled beyond recognition. He found himself laughing too, a sound so rusty from disuse that at first he didn't recognize it as his own. Mei Lin was quieter than Suyin, more reserved. But Thomas noticed the way she observed everything, her dark eyes taking in every detail of his cabin, his habits, his carefully maintained routine. On the second day, she began helping without asking, finding the rhythm of his household tasks and fitting herself into them. She cooked rice in a way he had never seen before, creating meals from his meager supplies that tasted like some kind of magic. She mended his clothes with stitches so small and precise they were almost invisible. It was on the third night, when Suyin had fallen asleep early, exhausted from their ordeal, that Thomas and Mei Lin sat together by the fire in a silence that felt different from the loneliness he had known before. She was working on embroidering something, her needle moving with the steady rhythm of practice, while he pretended to read his book but mostly just watched her hands move. She spoke suddenly, in halting English that surprised him.
You, alone, long time.
It wasn't a question. Somehow she had seen through him, understood the weight of his solitude in a way that made his chest tighten.
Yes,
he admitted.
7 years.
Lonely, she said, testing the word.
Lonely.
He nodded.
Very lonely.
She was quiet for a long moment, her needle pausing in mid-stitch. Then she said something in Chinese, soft and sad, and though he didn't understand the words, he understood the feeling behind them. She was lonely too. Perhaps had been for longer than 7 years. Perhaps had been lonely even when surrounded by people, a loneliness of the soul rather than circumstance. When the storm finally cleared on the 4th day, Thomas knew he should help them continue their journey. The logical thing would be to take them to the nearest town, help them find transportation to California, send them back to their lives while he returned to his. But the thought of it felt like losing something precious he hadn't known he needed until it appeared at his door covered in snow. Suyin wanted to leave as soon as possible, eager to reach her brother, to continue the journey they had started. But Mei Lin hesitated. Thomas saw it in the way she looked around the cabin, the way her hand lingered on the doorframe, the way she avoided meeting his eyes when Suyin talked about leaving. That evening, he worked up the courage to speak to her alone. Suyin had gone to the small shed behind the cabin to fetch more firewood, and Mei Lin was preparing dinner. Thomas stood awkwardly in the doorway, words tangling in his throat like weeds. Mei Lin, he started, then stopped. She turned to look at him, her expression patient and gentle. He tried again. You could stay. Both of you. Until spring at least. The journey to California, in winter, it's dangerous. She studied him for a long moment, and he felt like she could see every desperate, lonely corner of his soul. You want, we stay? She asked carefully. Yes, he said, the word coming out more forcefully than he intended. I want you to stay. I want you to stay. Something shifted in her expression, a wall coming down, revealing a vulnerability that matched his own. I stay, she said quietly. Suyin go brother. I stay. Over the next few weeks, they developed a new routine. Thomas took Suyin to the nearest town, helped her arrange safe passage to California with a family who was heading west with a wagon train. Suyin left with hugs and tears, making Mei Lin promise to write, making Thomas promise to take care of her friend. And then it was just the two of them, alone in the cabin as winter slowly released its grip on the land. The silence between them was different now. It was comfortable, punctuated by small conversations that grew longer as Mei Lin's English improved and Thomas learned more Chinese. They worked together during the day, their movements becoming synchronized without discussion. She would hand him nails before he asked for them while repairing the roof. He would fetch water before she needed it for cooking. They began to exist in the same space as if they had been doing it for years rather than weeks. But more than the practical partnership, something deeper was growing. Thomas found himself watching her when she didn't know he was looking, memorizing the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the small smile that played at her lips when she was pleased with something, the grace with which she moved through even the most mundane tasks. He would lie awake at night, separated from her by only a thin curtain he had hung to give her privacy, listening to her breathe and marveling at how the loneliness that had defined his existence for so long had transformed into something else entirely. Mei Lin seemed to be fighting her own battle with feelings. He would catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between longing and fear. They had never touched beyond the accidental brush of hands while passing tools or dishes, but those moments felt electric, charged with everything they weren't saying. It was spring when everything changed. Thomas had spent the day plowing the field for planting, and returned to find Mei Lin had prepared a special dinner. She had somehow managed to create dishes that reminded her of home using the limited ingredients available, and the cabin smelled wonderful. They ate together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink visible through the window. After dinner, as they sat by the fire, Mei Lin spoke. "In my country," she said slowly, carefully choosing words in English, "I was, how you say, promised to marry. Man I never meet. Family choose. But I not want. So I leave, come America with Suine." She paused, staring into the fire. "I think I find freedom here. I think loneliness better than life someone else choose for me." Thomas listened, his heart pounding. She continued, "But now I learn something. Loneliness not freedom. Just different cage." She turned to look at him then, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You teach me this. You show me what it is to choose for myself and choose someone who choose me back." Thomas reached out, hesitant, and took her hand. It was the first time they had deliberately touched, and it felt like lightning and coming home all at once. "I was dead before you came," he said quietly. "I was just surviving, existing. You made me remember what it feels like to be alive." She moved closer, and he wrapped his arms around her, feeling her melt against him. They stayed like that for a long time, two people who had been lonely for so long that they had forgotten what connection felt like, now finding it in each other. The seasons changed as they always did, but Thomas's cabin was no longer a lonely outpost at the edge of civilization. It became a home. Mei Lin's garden flourished with vegetables she had known in China, grown side by side with those native to the frontier. They taught each other their languages, their customs, their stories. Thomas learned to appreciate the tea ceremonies Mei Lin performed with the same reverence others might reserve for prayer. She learned the frontier skills he had mastered through necessity. By the time the next winter arrived, Mei Lin was his wife in every way that mattered, though they had no official ceremony. They had spoken their vows to each other under the stars one clear autumn night, their promises witnessed only by the vast sky and the land that had brought them together. It was enough. More than enough. Thomas would sometimes think back to the man he had been, lonely and resigned to a life of solitude. That person seemed like a stranger now. The loneliness hadn't just disappeared. It had been transformed into its opposite. Into belonging, into partnership, into love. All because two women had appeared at his door in the middle of a storm, and one of them had chosen to stay.